Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from The Smart Stitcher. In today's tutorial we will be talking how to add simple points to any gloves that you are making. So we'll take you through how to draft them on the pattern, how to transfer them onto your trank, and then finally how to stitch them. So let's get into it. Now ideally when you are adding your points you will be sewing them before you sew your trank together. I'm adding my points after today, so I'm going to show you kind of both methods. So how to add them while the pattern is flat, and then also how to add them if you happen to have sewn the glove up and then decided you wanted to add them as well. Historically, the points, from what I've read, would always start about 1/4 of an inch down from where that sort of finger webbing kind of ended, and then they would go down the back of the hand. When I've sort of tried this for certain gloves, I've found that I prefer a slightly longer distance, and I've used about 1.5 centimeters in the example I'm showing you today. I just found that just looks a little better on the hand. So I've started off by continuing the lines. So when we drew our glove pattern out, we had very sort of straight lines that ran down the fingers, and what I've done is continue that, and I've started marking out that center line and then done the left and the right sides after that. So I continued my pencil line down and then got to where the base of the fingers was and marked 1.5 centimeters away from that particular point. I then, from a practice sample I worked out that I quite like a length of about 6 centimeters, so I then added my 6 centimeters in length, and then I've kept that line in because it's quite a useful reference point. I then came over to my base of my finger, so I've got another mark here, and for the index finger another mark here for between the 4th and 5th fingers. Now from what I've read as well, the points always had a slightly kind of different finish, and that the middle one was slightly shorter and the two on the outside slightly longer, but again you can very much play about with that to get the effect you want to create. So what I've done here is just I've measured half an inch away from that last center point there, and then half an inch out left and right, so joining up my dots from the 4th and 5th finger, the index and the middle finger, and that's how I've got my 3 lines there. Now ideally when you're cutting out the pattern and you're drawing everything on, this is the point where you would transfer those lines, and obviously check that whatever you're using isn't going to get rubbed out. So I've got that there. I would transfer them, whether or not when you take the pattern off, if you wish to draw lines or if you wish to do a dotted line or just keep the dots, that's entirely up to you. I'm now going to show you the way, if you've made your glove up, how you can add them on, and then we'll get underway with the sewing. If you're adding your points after you have sewn up the glove, I'd like to sort of try and start by sort of making sure that I've got at least one straight edge to work from. Now you could pick the side of the glove that runs down the little finger, or the side of the glove that goes down by the index finger, and we're going to sort of start out with a little bit of eyeballing to try and get into that right place. So I'm going to do the same method. I'm starting with my center line, and then I'm going to work out to the left and the right. I'm still measuring down 1.5 centimeters, so I've got my ruler level with the base of the finger. I can then measure 1.5 centimeters, and I'm going to make a dot. I'm then going to count down my 6 centimeters, make another dot, and I'm just going to do some very, very light dots in between. Now I know that my points are going to be about 1/2 inch beyond my line, and then out to the left and the right to create this particular effect. So I'm just going to get that ready now. So I've marked my last point. I know is where I want my sort of points to spread out from, so this is where my stitching will finish, and down here is where my left and right will finish. So I'm going to just measure out 1/2 inch or 1.27 centimeters out to either side, and now I'm going to join up my left and my right lines in the same way to create that kind of V shape. So again, I'm measuring 1.5 centimeters down, and making sure that I've got an even a solid number on the end there, measuring my 1.5 centimeters, and again I'm going to make a dot and take that all the way down to my final dot there. And then same again on this side. Again, it's better if you can to do this without having sewn the glove up, but just in case that's not possible, then you can add it in, but you're going to want to sort of check it really carefully by eye. So I'm just going to come all the way down to my sort of final point there, and then we've got that drawn out. Now I know that I can get rid of my silver pen very easily with a baby wipe. So I'm going to get these marked up, we're going to get them stitched, and then they are done. So I just want to check now that both gloves look fairly balanced, and I think even through the camera I'm sort of fairly happy with that. And when I've got the glove on, I can see that the points will sit quite nicely on the back of my hand there. I think they look quite elegant. So let's get into the stitching. To start the thread off, we're going to do a very similar stitch to that which we've done when sewing our gloves. I'm starting on the base of the center line, and I've kind of marked with my needle where that sort of final spot is, and that's where I'm going to do my starting stitches. So I've gone through the back of the leather without actually coming through to the front, and what I'm going to do now is pull my thread through. So I'm using probably about 60 centimeters of thread or so in the needle. I've waxed and I've doubled it over using a Betweens number 7, and this is just a Gutermanns cotton thread, and I'm gone through my leather so you can't see the stitch from the front, but I'm then going through it a second time, and sometimes it does like to knot up a bit, so you've just got to be a little bit patient with it. And before I pull the loop tight, I'm going to take my needle back through almost as though I was doing a little buttonhole stitch, and that will allow me just to even out the loops. And then this time I'm going to pull the loops, pull them nice and tight so they'll sit against the leather. Now don't go yanking it really hard because it will come off. I can now get rid of that little tail. Sometimes that's quite handy to keep hold of when you're starting, just to get a good grip. I'm going to just give it a very gentle hammer, and that will flatten the knot. It will mean that the camera shakes a little bit, so bear with. But that just means that it's a little more comfortable on the back of the hand. Now the next thing I'm going to do is to come out, and I'm going to come out on my sort of very last stitch, which is about here, and that's going to be, well, my very last gap, that's going to be my first stitch. So I just want to come out on that mark, or just to the side of it, but very close to it. I'm going to bring my thread through, and I want to check that everything is flat on the back and that everything is pulled through, nothing is left behind. Now we're on to folding to create our points. Now I have seen it used that you can push a pin through the start and end points and then just fold your leather so that the fold sits between those two pins. I personally don't sort of find that too helpful for me, because I'm going to use some clips to help with mine, but that's one way in which you can then hold your leather up and then you can sew as I'm about to show you. So you can have it up between those two pins and use that as a guide to keep your line. The other method I'm going to show you is I'm going to be using a couple of fabric clips, and all we want to do is just fold along that line. So I'm very carefully making sure that I'm starting and finishing and that my dots are nice and even. I'm just going to use a couple of clips to hold it to help keep it in place whilst I sew along. Now where I've brought my thread out, I'm going to just sort of start off by doing a little back stitch. Now when we are sewing these points, they are literally just going across and through the very, very top of that fold. So there's hardly anything there that to sort of stitch through. Now, these points are just for a decorative effect. They're not to help with fit. So you're literally just taking the tiniest amount, the bare minimum, and sewing through the fold. And I'm just about to show you that now. So we're using a stab stitch like we've done on sort of sewing this particular glove. I'm going to start off by using a back stitch. So where I've brought my thread out, I'm going to keep my fold folded handily, and I'm going to go backwards for probably about 2 or 3 millimeters, and I want to come out by sort of going under the minimum amount of fold in that leather that I can. And I'm then going to pull my thread through, make sure that my loops are flat, and then I'm going to start sewing along. Now, this is where we've got to kind of keep it. The stitches are going to be really small, and you are literally just going through the smallest amount of leather you can to create your stitch. And again, it's always worth, if you've got a little offcut of leather, having a little practice first. And we're going to work our way along the line doing this stab stitch. Again, keep your eye on your loops, make sure everything is nice and straight. And I've also just keeping an eye on my silver pen to make sure that I'm not straying off and away from my line. So that is all I'm going to do. I'm going to work my way along. I'm going to make sure my threads are nice and flat. I am going to sort of pull it tight, but if I'm pulling it tight and the leather's bunching up behind me, I know that I've pulled it too tight for what we're looking for. So I'm going to work my way along, and when I get to the other end, I will show you how to finish your thread off. And remember, you are going along taking the smallest amount of leather that you can through the fold that you're stitching through. So you don't want to sort of be right down here trying to make a stitch. It's literally very, very close to that top there, the closest you can get without ripping the leather out. So join me at the other end in just a moment. So I've finished my line of stitching, and now I'm ready to finish off my thread. So I'm gone back through the leather almost as though I'm going to make another stitch, but I've actually gone through just a single layer of leather this time. I'm not coming out to create the other side of the point. I'm going to wiggle about a bit, turn the glove inside out, so that when I push the needle out, I can then see where I'm going to be finishing everything else off. So bring your needle out, and this is where you just want to check to make sure that you haven't got any loops left on the outside. Make sure they're pulled nice and firmly, and then we're going to finish our stitch off just the same way that we've started. Now you can give a sort of slightly gentle pull, and you can expose some of the stitches and just do your finishing stitch underneath there. If you are exposing stitches, just be careful that you don't inadvertently sort of pull them too hard and start to split the leather. So to finish off, I'm going to take my needle under a couple of stitches there, pull the thread through so it's nice and flat. I'm going to go back through again under just one stitch this time to create my loop, and then before I pull my loop tight, I'm going to take my thread back through, make sure that everything is pulled down, and then give that a nice gentle tug, make sure they are completely as tight as they can be, and then I can cut them off and give them a gentle hammer. Now the good news is, if your thread is still viable, you can use that same thread to carry on and sew the remaining 2 points on that hand. If not, start a new thread off. Now to do the next set of points, I'm basically now repeating the technique that we've done, starting the thread off at the base, working my way up to the tip. I'll be using the clips to help fold over, and that's basically all you would do to sew your points. We're using the prix stitch, which is nice and simple, and it's the same stitch that we've used elsewhere on the gloves as well, so it kind of gives it a nice kind of balance in terms of the sort of design and the nice effect. So the next thing to do is to get all your other points sewn up. Here we have the finished points now stitched into place, and there's just one more little bit of finishing I'd like to do. So I know that my silver pen came off with the baby wipe, so I've given both gloves a really good wipe, and now what I'm going to do is just use my cobbler's last to help me just hammer and flatten these seams a little bit more. It helps for this particular stage if you've got something that's quite solid to hammer against. It's also useful to have a few bits of scrap leather just around that you can use as a barrier, so that you don't run the risk of damaging the leather you have just stitched. So on here I've folded again along my stitch line, and I'm just going to use a little leather barrier, and then I'm just literally going to go through and just hammer along all my lines of stitching, and this just helps to flatten out the stitches, to give them a nice finish, to flatten the knots so that they don't scratch against the skin. And I'm just going to work my way along and do that now to each of the points that I have created. And here we have our completed points, all nice and hammered. It just adds a nice sort of crispness to the kind of finish of them, and just flattens out the stitching a little bit more, which helps to settle it down. As you can see, I think they look really nice. You know, you can vary the length, you can vary the size, you know, play about with it. Maybe you even want to try a different stitch. You know, there's all sorts of possibilities that you can add in. So happy stitching, everyone.